Let's come to interval 5. And we're looking at one of the most peculiar characters in history. His name was Hui-neng, and his petrified body still exists in China. This was a photograph taken of it by Joseph Needham, who was from Cambridge University in England, and is the man who did the 20 volumes of Science and Civilization in China. He was an engineer, scientist, and he took this photograph at the Cao Chi Monastery, the self-mummified body of Hui-neng. Hui-neng lived in the great heyday of the Tang Dynasty in the 600s. And when he was born, there were very special indications, and 2 Taoist priests came to the newborn, and they said, the child born last night requires an auspicious name. The first character should be Hui, and the second Neng. What do Hui and Neng mean? Inquired the father, because they were largely illiterate people. The priest answered, Hui means to bestow beneficence on sentient beings. Neng means the capacity to carry out the affairs of the Buddha. When they had finished speaking, they left, and there is no one who knows where they went. So you get a very interesting kind of a reverberation of the birth of a magical child and the wise men coming to determine that this actually has occurred and then to bestow the name. Hui-neng was just a working man. He was employed largely as a woodcutter to go out and gather wood and bring it into town. And it wasn't until he was 24 years old that he heard an old man reading out loud from a book, from a scroll. And when he heard the man reading out loud, he understood perfectly what the scroll was saying, but the man reading it, though he was literate and though he was a monk, could not understand it. And so Hui-neng asked him where he got it. And he said, I got this scroll from the 5th Patriarch, the Zen master Hongzhen, and that he lives in a city some distance away, and that this scroll is called the Diamond Cutter Sutra. It's in Sanskrit called the Vajra Chadika. Vajra is diamond. Chadika means the patient cutting of something to bring out its luster. And the Diamond Sutra itself is a condensation, a trimming down to the bare bones of a much larger sutra that was called the Prajna Paramita Sutra. It means the wisdom perfection, the perfection of wisdom sutra. And it's the perfection of wisdom sutra originally was about 8,000 lines, and the Vajracchedika, the Diamond Cutter Sutra, is only 300 lines. And so it is just 5% of what the larger sutra was. What is peculiar is that when Hui-neng went to see Hongzhen, he had to ask his mother to excuse himself because he was the breadwinner. His father died when he was 3. And the family was just the mother and the son, and he largely had to support them. And so he got permission from her to go and see the fifth patriarch of Zen Buddhism, Hung Gen. And when he got there were many monks studying. And one in particular was like the senior monk, and everyone assumed that he was going to inherit the mantle of the Zen master, which would be his bowl, his begging bowl, and his robe. The tradition in Buddhism was that you could only have in use, not as a possession, a begging bowl and a robe that you would make out of scraps every spring. You would go to the cast-off rags that people would throw out for spring cleaning, and you would take a number of different rags and you would sew them together because you were permitted to have a needle as well. So you could have a needle and a begging bowl, and you would make your patchwork robe. Now, when you see Buddhists today, you see them in beautiful robes. You see the black robes, or the red robes, or the yellow robes, the saffron robes, the color of sunlight. The original robes were always like patchwork quilts of just rags. They were not pretty to look at, and they were self-made every year. So the passing of the robe on by this time meant that the tradition had become hidebound. There was such a beautifully made robe that one could pass it on for hundreds of years. When Hui-neng went there, he worked in the kitchen scrubbing pots for about 5, 6, 7 months. And then the Zen master, Hung Gen, said that he was going to pick his successor if someone would post their spiritual poems, their 4-line verses, post them in calligraphy on a board, and that he would choose his successor from this. So the senior monk, Shen Shui, put his up, and everyone thought, well, no one will be able to beat this. But when Hui-neng was finished, and he was coming back from the kitchen, he read the verse that was put up by this senior monk, and he shook his head. And Hung Gen, by that time, had just come to inspect the verses and just saw the one verse there. By this time, our Hui-neng was able to write enough so that he could write his own little verse. Shen Hui's verse was about the mirror mind being completely free of dust so that it could show the world pristinely. And Hui-neng's verse was, there is no mirror in the mind. Where is there any place for dust to collect? And so Hung Gen gave the kitchen boy the robe and the bowl, and then he told him, you better get out of town. Because this is high power authority. There are thousands of people in the hierarchical structure. They have made all their plans, and they have sucked up to the senior monk that they expect to hold it, and you're not even in the company. You're not in the corporation. You're not in the power structure at all. And so he lit out before dawn with the bowl and the robe, and he disappeared for 16 years. Held menial jobs, and in that time, deepened and deepened and deepened. And when he was in his early 40s was the first time that he surfaced and gave a public display of what he knew. Hui-neng follows an ancient tradition that spiritual language is always in a poetic. It is never rhetorical. It's not in a rhetoric form, nor is it in a mythological style. It's not mythic, it's not symbolic. And the poetic means that it has come out of a different horizon. If you look at the way in which actions are taken, existential actions, what you do, they come out of nature. They come out of the horizon of nature, naturalness. Experience is also that mythic horizon where language is, and out of that comes the symbolic forms of rhetorical things. But poetry is an art, and it comes out of visionary consciousness. So that if one's poetry has just come out of your experience, it will have a certain tone to it. It will have a tone that has a certain character to it and will be able to be put into the mind as an image in the imagination and of an idea in your conception. But poetry is a completely different kind of language. A poem is not a form that is integral. It is a form that is differential in that it opens up more and more as you learn to read poetry, as you learn who wrote this, the person's person, it shines through the poem, and one can then develop a sense of poetry. And this poetry is true when it is spontaneous. Thought out poems are not very good. They're rhetorically good, but they're not poetically good. And so the time-honored tradition always in the ancient world was that if you were spiritually awakened, you would have the ability to make spontaneous spirit poems. Sometimes they're called psalms, sometimes they're called hymns. The first person to make these kinds of spirit songs lived about 4,000 years ago in Iranian Central Asia, and his name was Zarathustra. And Zarathustra's gathas are songs that have this illustrious quality to them. And in Zarathustra's gathas, there are 6 spiritual facets that occur. And the first one that is sort of like the tether is Asha. She is the spirit of order, not rhetorical order, not mental order, but a spiritual order, so complete that it flows back into nature through a mind that is purified. If the mind is not purified, then the spiritual energy of that order will be commandeered by the mind and distorted, and will not go back into nature. So that one of the qualities of the high spirit is always, if the mind is pure, your person, your poetic language will be able to be carried through the creative imagination of your visionary consciousness into the mind where the memory now is remembering who this is, not in the sense of an identity, not in the sense of somebody's character, not in the sense of a figure, but the mysterious differential openness, the jewel-like quality of your true person. The idea, though, of a person will reduce it down so that it becomes just a rhetorical, symbolic thing. And this was the number one problem in the world about 2,000 years ago. The inability, because minds had become very sophisticated, very strong, rhetorical forms had really become quite thick and took a long time to master. And so you had this kind of confusing filter that the more tightly ordered it was, the less that it let the winds of spiritual consciousness come back through and go back into nature. And just in the same way, nature could not come back and go through the mind and go into one's spirit. And so consciousness and nature were cut off by a closed mind that was proud of its ability to close all the loopholes, and that it was therefore the arbiter of everything that was real. The Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, the Prajnaparamita Sutra, is all about 500, 600 years after the Buddha actually lived and taught, of going back and getting a secret resonance, getting the perfume of the flower of what had happened at that time, and to bring it back into play. The figure that mysteriously embodies this is that there is a lady Prajnaparamita, a lady of special spirit wisdom, and she is the one who conveys this perfume in the beauty of her reality. The beauty of her reality is the perfume of the ongoingness, the larger jeweled radiance of the Buddha's further teachings. And so the Prajnaparamita Sutra was written about 100 AD in northwest India, where Kashmir is, just by the high mountain passes that go over the Hindu Kush into the inner Asian stretches. On some trails you go into Tibet, on others you go into access to one of the edges of the Gobi Desert, and on another you can go into the long caravan routes that go all the way back to Iranian Central Asia. And there are ways to go into Afghanistan from there as well. So that whole area at the time was a part of an empire called the Kushan Empire, and the king was named Kanishka. That Prajnaparamita Sutra had a very special tone to it because it was a Mahayana Sutra, which was new at that time. It means the Great Way. And it means the Great Way in a contrast to a small way. The small way is for someone to use the classic methodology of meditation to save themselves. Whereas the Great Way is that you forego classic methodology for the experimental, possible, extravagant opening out of new explorations of the spirit. And the purpose is not to just save yourself, but to save everyone else before you. And so that figure is called a bodhisattva. That particular lineage, that particular style, though it was there originally in the historical Buddha, was brought out around 100 AD, and the Prajnaparamita Sutra is the first one that brings this out. In 1931, on one of those high passes that goes almost into Ladakh and parts of Tibet, about 3 miles from a frontier town called Gilgit, they found a number of old manuscripts, but they were not really translated and dealt with adequately until about 1945. And in this time period is exactly when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, as in Qumran in Israel. The Nag Hammadi books were found in Egypt, and a great many of the Mahayana books were found in parts of India and Tibet, all at the same time, all at the end of World War II, which is not just the end of World War II, but the date of the first atomic bombs. And it's as if the cream of ancient wisdom that had been lost for thousands of years all of a sudden was revealed as soon as the atomic bombs were detonated. It was as if the world itself disclosed secret, hidden things to help us to understand, not to get lost in our minds, not to get lost in the authority of imposed social and political and religious structures, but to free ourselves, to come back. So that the Perfection of Wisdom sutras are very often illustrated. One of the earliest ones is called the Lotus Sutra. And the Lotus Sutra has been illustrated maybe about 50,000 times. It comes in all sizes, all kinds of decorations, and its largest form is called the Threefold Lotus Sutra. It is a Prajnaparamita Sutra as well. But the Perfection of Wisdom has a very interesting quality to it. It means that there is such a thing as perfect knowledge. And the first place that you find someone writing a spiritual hymn, writing a spiritual poem about perfect knowledge is in the Odes of Solomon. And as we are supposing, the Odes of Solomon could well have been written by Mary Magdalene around 40 AD in the Jerusalem of that day, before there was a Christianity. But because of her knowing Jesus in a very special way, the 23rd Ode to Solomon reads like this at the beginning. Joy is for the holy ones, and who shall put it on but they alone? Grace is for the elect ones, and who shall receive it but they who trusted in it from the beginning? Love is for the elect ones, and who shall put it on but they who possessed it from the beginning? Walk in the knowledge of the Lord, and you will know the grace of the Lord generously, both for his exaltation and for the perfection of his knowledge. And so you get the beginnings of what was the spark for the Prajnaparamita. How does it get to India? It gets to India because those who were closest to Mary Magdalene, we know now from the Nag Hammadi material that has been found that there are many documents that put her together with Thomas and Matthew and Philip. The Gospel of Thomas is about the little seed sayings, the wisdom sayings of Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew is about the sermons of Jesus, the 5 examples of how those seeds are opened out into larger presentations. And the Gospel of Philip is all about the sacred mysteries of the bridal chamber, that one is not just a single conscious heart, but that a pair of conscious hearts together create an interchange resonance that reaches out in a very special way and is the basis of a spiritual community. That spiritual community is not a sociological event. It's not a political structure. It's not a religious authority. It is, in fact, a weaving of resonances together, because once one knows how to exchange in spiritual love with an other, that has no bound, in the sense that then you could include others, and there is such a thing then as a community that includes all beings. In Buddhism, sometimes it's referred to as sentient beings. Sentient is wisdom of the heart, rather than intelligent sentient. Even animals are included as sentient beings. Thomas and Matthew and Philip and Mary Magdalene are always together, and their dialogues between each other generate this wisdom, this perfect knowledge that is possible to have. And it's that in their talking together, they are led by the guide of that spirit person of Jesus, not the man, but the ongoing resonance of his teaching, of his way, of his presence. The only other figures in the New Testament that have that particular tone are James, the brother of Jesus, the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews, who was Apollos of Alexandria, and St. John. Now, St. John was only 12 years old when Jesus was crucified. That's why at the Last Supper, St. John leans his head on Jesus' chest when he's told, the table is told that someone here is going to betray me. And young boy, 12 years old, Jesus was about 45 years old at the time, laid his head on his chest. He said, "Lord, is it me? Am I going to be the one to betray you?" And in John, he's always referred to as the disciple that Jesus loved, because he loved him like a father would love a son, and gave 12-year-old John in adoption to Mary Magdalene to raise. And that's why St. John's language, his gospel and the book of Revelation and his letters are so extraordinary, because he was raised by this poetic spiritual genius of Mary Magdalene. They stayed in Jerusalem until James was killed. He was martyred in 44 AD, and so Mary Magdalene moved John and the mother of Jesus and herself to Ephesus. And in Ephesus, one can still find the ruins of the Church of St. John, the ruins of the great church that was dedicated to Mary, and also the Cave of the Seven Sleepers, where the sarcophagus of Mary Magdalene still is there. The bones were taken out some hundreds of years ago and taken to southern France, but the great, huge sarcophagus is still there. I think in the notes, the vision notes, which you can get copies of next week, I have a photograph of the sarcophagus of Mary Magdalene. It's still there. And also a photograph of the rebuilt house where the mother of Jesus lived her last couple of years. When Jesus was crucified, his mother was 59 years old. Mary Magdalene lived until about 57 AD. And then when she died is when Apollos of Alexandria went to Ephesus to make sure that her burial and her death were handled in exactly the right way. And of course, John was present as well. When Thomas went to India, he went there in 41 AD. He went to southern India. And it was along the southern India coast, Kerala, where Roman trade had been for centuries. The ships would leave about 400 miles south of Cairo on the Dead Sea and go around the coasts in the Arabian Sea all the way to southern India and to Taprobani, which was Sri Lanka, Ceylon. And even in later time, in the time of Trajan, Roman ships went as far as Vietnam and also overland to China. But the reason for going to South India is that was the home, original home of the spices, especially of pepper and many other fragrant spices. And the spice trade was extraordinarily lucrative. Before it was cut off, there were ships going all the time. What was interesting is that there were international trading families who had taken their expertise on running caravan routes for several thousand years and also ran the shipping routes. And so in southern India, you had a large Jewish population. And that's why Thomas went to India, was to carry the gospel to those communities in South India. And he was there for the rest of his life. And it is in South India that you find for the first time the beginnings of a new quality that one had never seen in India before. There is such a quality as bhakti, but there never was a quality that is specifically like Hellenistic Jewish faith. And so the very first great Mahayana work is called The Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana by Asvaghosha, who came from that region of India and was followed by the second great Buddhist teacher of that time, Nagarjuna, who also was from South India. And is Nagarjuna who wrote the first commentary in verse on the Prajnaparamita Sutra, which was new at that time. Now, both Asvaghosha and Nagarjuna were famous in their days, not just for being brilliant, not just for being Buddhists, but for being the great songwriters of the day. A Chinese traveler, even hundreds of years later, said everyone knows the songs of Asvaghosha and of Nagarjuna and can sing them. Hundreds and hundreds of songs, that they were brilliant as the poet-singers of the day as well. And so one finds in the works of Asvaghosha and Nagarjuna, constantly when they're going to teach something that is high in wisdom, they will write it in poetry, in verse. And that if there is a prose, the prose will come to a hiatus, to a stop, and a poem will be put in that prose at that place to carry the language out of the mind into the conscious flow of the spirit person. And one finds this in the Platform Sutra of Hui-neng, who is in that tradition. So that when you come to a certain quality, Hui-neng will stop his prose and will give you a poem. Here's a sample. The master Hui-neng said, "All of you listen to the 2 verses I have made. Their import is taken from the verses of the priest Bodhidharma, the first patriarch. If you deluded one's practice according to these verses, you will, without fail, see into your own true natures." The first verse says, "If evil flowers bloom in the mind ground, 5 blossom flower from the stem. Together practice the prajna wisdom. In the future, this will be the enlightenment of the Buddha." And the second verse says, "If correct flowers bloom in the mind ground, 5 blossoms flower from the stem. Together practice the prajna wisdom. In the future, this will be the enlightenment of the Buddha." In the Prajna Paramita Sutra, one of the most startling things is that near the end, one of the rarest occurrences in all of the Buddhist literature is that the Buddha smiles. He smiles because a very special woman has come into the congregation, and she has made it clear that she is not afraid. She is not terrified. She is glad to be there, and the Buddha smiles at her. So one of the head monks asks him, "Buddhas do not smile for only special reasons. Why have you smiled at her?" And he says of her, "She is the future Buddha. Her name will be the Golden Flower Buddha. And she is the next one who will come." Just as I was predicted to become a Buddha by an ancient Buddha named Dipankara, I predict that here she is. This is the Golden Flower Buddha, and she will come in the next time period called the Stellar Aeon. And those of you who know my work know it is all about building a civilization, a stellar-wide civilization for this new aeon. My book isn't called Our New Aeon. So it's quite interesting the way in which all of these aspects weave together, and you can appreciate that the Mahayana is different from classical Buddhism, which was a development from the Hindu, from the Vedas, from the Upanishads, and a very good development. But the Mahayana has a different thread that is woven into it. It has a thread of ancient Zarathustrian wisdom, of Pythagorean Egyptian wisdom, of Hellenistic Jewish wisdom, and of early Christianity before it was doctrinaire. And so all of those are brought together in the figure of Mary Magdalene and the figure of the Golden Flower Buddha to come, and also sometimes named Maitreya, and the development of that wisdom figure who becomes Kuan Yin. So in a very real way, Mary Magdalene in Asia has a resonance as Kuan Yin through the Prajna Paramita transform literature. And so one has a very peculiar thing, that whenever there were wise Jews or Christians that went into Central Asia, they were always welcomed. And in the Tang Dynasty especially, they were welcomed as carrying the highest wisdom. When we come back from the break, we'll take a look at that. Let's come back to our learning. Our learning is a very well-developed laminar. It means that there are different layers that flow. One of the qualities of learning is to be able to use the mind for thinking, but not to abuse the mind by having it be a tyrannical master. In the Arabian Nights, one of the parables, Sinbad gets this mean old man who climbs onto his shoulders and locks his legs around his jugular so that if Sinbad tries to get rid of him, he will choke him to death with his bony legs. And so this bony old man has Sinbad carry him around, and he lords it over him like the tyrannical mind would do. But Sinbad learns that he can outlast the man in not needing sleep, and as soon as the old man nods off for 1 second, Sinbad throws him off and is freed from him. Meditation, contemplation, prayer are a way to outlast the mind, because the mind, being an integral form, is not infinite. It is bound. It is bounded. It has boundaries. It has limits. Whereas your spirit is unlimited. And you can wait out the mind by patience. You can also wait out the mind by being specifically careful in your actions. And you can also outstrip your mind in a thing called giving. If you constantly give, not to someone, the old ancient code is actually exists still in the code of Maimonides, about 1300 AD. He says the highest form of charity is that no one knows who gives and no one knows who receives. It's just the givingness itself. These qualities are in Mahayana Buddhism, and they're called perfections. They're called paramitas. So that what we're looking at now is the way in which the Prajna Paramita Sutra developed out of the contact of high Hellenistic Judaism and early Jewish Christianity before it became Roman Christianity, or before it became, as St. Paul said, I'm an apostle to the Gentiles. Who is a Gentile? Who is a Jew? It is about universal person having a relationship to an infinite cosmos, not to some kind of limitation, not to a sociological wedge, but to open out. Our education has this laminar flow, and we still use books because books are the way in which the contemplative mind interfaced with the symbolic structure of thought for the last 2,000 years. And everything that we are ensconced in, surrounded in, has been made in this way. Now, we are of a generation where we are transforming this and freeing ourselves from this. But in order to do so, we still have to learn how to read, and we still have to learn that we are reading in a very meditative way. In early Roman times, in schools, only boys were educated, and they had to read out loud. You were struck with a blow if you read silently. Part of this was changed because reading silently makes a voice in the mind. And the voice in the mind, when you're reading silently, does not have to speak the words, but looks through the words to the images. So when you teach young children how to read, you teach them the knack of seeing the story in their minds through the words, that the words are not an encoding, but that they are an ongoing transparency. And so learning to tell yourself a story by silently reading it is a very high form of meditation. Our education is based on the ability to wean ourselves away from soundbite, ground-up atomism, and to return us back to the flow of the experience. And part of the flow of the experience is in our choice of year-long readings. To spread out a major reading experience over a whole year so that you read just a little bit each week is the same effect as learning to walk with snowshoes. Snowshoes were developed by the northern Algonquin Indians because you cannot walk with your regular feet in high snow fall and high snow drifts. But with snowshoes, you distribute the weight over a wide enough area that you can walk on snow with snowshoes, whereas if you tried to walk with just shoes, booted feet, you would sink in. So learning to read something that is major over a year teaches you the snowshoe effect of distributing your attentiveness in the mind so that it is like the experience of going into a contemplative flow for a year. Each year, I make available 4 choices. This year, 2005, the 4 choices are taken from the 4 corners of the world. One of them is from India, the Ramayana. One of them is from China, the Journey to the West, sometimes called Monkey. One is from Arabia, Scheherazad's Arabian Nights. And one is from Europe, Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. And I have portioned out so that the readings are distributed over the entire year. And you can choose any one of the 4, but stick with it, and stick with the portioning out so that you get this layer. This is like a basic traction. Then in these presentations, every 12 presentations constitute a phase with a punctuation like we're doing today of a 13th an integral. And the integral makes a space not only between the phases, but also makes a space between the 4 phases of a year and the year-long reading journey, so that you get a different kind of emotion. But because they are in resonance with each other, they begin to fortify each other in a very special way. You begin to sense that you have a lot more attentiveness than you had before. It's like someone who exercises gets more strength. And if you exercise in this graduated way, you will find that your ability to read begins to get an amperage to it, an oomph. And it also will reflect itself in your ability to write, because reading and writing are very much a kind of a yin-yang of that whole experience. What develops out of this is your ability to see into what words are telling you, so that you will be able to see false things in false world. If you see words that are not right, you will intuit right away. If things are true, you will intuit that in some way you could get to the truth of this. Now, this is the substrate of the learning in terms of books. But every phase, we also bring in films. For the art phase, I've brought in 4 of the greatest art films ever made. One of them is Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. One of them is Jean Renoir's Grand Illusion. Another is Howard Hawks' The Big Sleep. And the fourth is Zeffirelli's The Taming of the Shrew, Shakespeare. If you'll portion these films out so that you see one every month, you can see the fourth one on the interval. And the phases also change pairs of books every month, so that you'll have 3 pairs of books in a phase and then a special book for the 13th phase. And by going into this pattern, in this particular kind of thing, using a pair of books 4 times, 3 times 4 to a set of 12 punctuated by an interval, and 4 of those in a year, and then a double year cycle, what we're doing is we're setting up a new way of combing out the snarls of the false inculcated mislearning. Not only of combing it out and getting rid of the snarls, but of introducing a calibration which is both natural and conscious at the same time, so that they complement each other, so that nature is conscious for you and that your consciousness is natural. Now, this is a kind of a learning that also requires music. For vision, the music to listen to the whole phase was Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road Journeys, his great ensemble of singers and different musicians. The music selection for the interval is Sarah Vaughan and Quincy Jones' Misty. Just to play that song for yourself a couple of times, and it gives you a very interesting interchange of 2 musical geniuses bringing themselves together in a song that has a very special quality to it. It has a visionary quality to it. And then for art, the selection of music is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And the words for the Ninth Symphony we already looked at when we looked at Schiller, because he wrote that ode to freedom. We're now taking a look in this interval at Hui-neng, who is the founder of what became Zen Buddhism. Zen is the Japanese pronunciation of Chinese Chan, and Chan is the Chinese pronunciation of the Sanskrit dhyana. And dhyana means meditation. It means meditation in a special way that as you meditate, and you really meditate, you don't just think about meditating, or you don't think while you're meditating, but you really just meditate. Meditation has an integral that surfaces naturally into it. And what it produces then, it's called concentration. But it's not concentration like you're packing something together. What you're doing is you're allowing the mind to concentrate itself naturally in an integral that is not based on what it is thinking about. Normally, we are told that the mind must be clear in its conceptions, and that if the conceptions match with the perceptions, then in that identity, one has the sense of certainty, of actuality. But the fact is that the mind naturally does not limit itself to ideas. The mind also has imagination as a formal structure. The imagination is as real and necessary to the mind as ideas are to the mind. And without the imagination, ideas become tyrannical. And without ideas, the imagination becomes chaotic. And so ideas and the imagination work together. And when they work together, the structure of the mind integrals itself concentrates itself, and it shows up especially in prayer, in contemplation, in meditation, in that a very special quality begins to happen. The mind begins to be able to see the flow of images, the flow of pictures in the imagination, but because it's concentrating, those images more and more become not just images, but become symbols. They become symbolic. And when one is able to see not just the images in the reading of the words, but to see the symbols behind the images through the words, the mind now acquires a knack for something surprising. It can get that symbols can integral many, many images and many, many ideas, and that there are then very powerful symbols that integral symbols, and that there is a master symbol that one can bring clearly into the mind that controls all the symbols, that organizes all of the images that there are and all of the ideas that there are, and that there is yet one more capacity, one more knack. You can patiently outwait that master symbol, and it will, after a while, blink out and then blink back in. Because it is not there statically, it is there energetically, which means that everything that happens in the mind happens by iteration. It's not just there statically, but it's there vibrationally. And you can become tuned enough, integraled enough, to be able to pick up the spaces in between the iterations of images, in between the spaces of the iterations of symbols. And finally, refined enough to see that the master symbol itself also has a periodicity, very, very rapid, but you can be finer than that. And what you see is that in between its iterations, the mind is completely transparent. It's not just open, but it's transparent. And it's this transparency of the mind that allows for consciousness to be real. Because the consciousness is the flow relationally in between, and it is all of the spaces in their natural reality of one space, not one thing, but an infinite openness. It is this that is called the Buddha nature in Buddhism. It's this that is called the divine in the West. And it's this that in Zen, in Chan, in dhyana, meditation, concentration, that form the basis of the release then of a quality of understanding, not by the mind, but by reality. And the understanding by reality is called prajna, it's called wisdom. What gets in the way is that the mind is habituated to looking at things in this world and then reproducing them in images in the mind. So one of the releases is to find an image that is capable of calibrating itself to a symbol, that is capable of calibrating itself to the ultimate symbol, and that is capable of calibrating itself to include the openness as well as the master symbol. And this is usually the ability to look into the eyes of another and see yourself. And if the other is looking at you in complete spiritual openness, you will see that, and you will be that as well. In the 13th Ode of Solomon, this is how she wrote it. Behold, the Lord is our mirror. Open your eyes and see them in him, and learn the manner of your face, and then declare praises to his spirit, and wipe the paint from your face, and love his holiness and put it on, then you will be unblemished at all times with him. Hallelujah. This is very high Dharma stuff. It's exactly what Kuan Yin does in Asia. And what's interesting is that Kuan Yin, at the inception, is a woman who was capable of being masculine as well, and later on is a masculine who is capable of returning and being a woman again. And this is one of the great mysteries in Asia. When Kuan Yin is masculine, he then is a bodhisattva called Avalokiteshvara. You can say it, as we talked last week, in two different ways. Ishvara is the ancient spirit from the Upanishads, but you can say it Avalokiteshvara, and it means someone who hears sound pristinely. One hears the screech of brakes pristinely. And Avalokiteshvara is the bodhisattva of compassion, and the embodiment in the Vajrayana of Avalokiteshvara is the Dalai Lama. So the entire Dalai Lama lineage is the lineage of the expression of Avalokiteshvara within a special form of the Vajrayana called the Gelugpas, and the Gelugpas are the debaters. They're specially trained to be able to go into any kind of an argument, pro or con, together, and to hold both sides pristinely so that they are perfectly balanced, so that neither the pro nor the con wins, but because they're perfectly balanced, one could go forever, except that if you're doing it in a meditative way, you learn that the pro and the con, when they're evenly matched, they generate an equilibrium that very easily vibrates into the space of reality. And so one has this quality that's there. In Zen, from Hui-neng, it is a very special thing. He presents the Prajna Paramita, the Lady Prajna Paramita, before Avalokiteshvara, and after Avalokiteshvara when it's Kuan Yin, but presents it as a masculine who is able to see her at work. And so he has a quality like this. This is how his Sutra begins. They say, the master Hui-neng ascended the high seat of the lecture hall at Ta Fan Temple and expounded the Dharma of the great perfection of wisdom. And when he begins to speak, here's a man who didn't know until he was 24 that he could hear wisdom, who was given the imprimatur of the bowl and the robe of the fifth patriarch Hui-neng, and then told to hide because people would be after him for 16 years, lived as a working man. And only after 40 did he begin to teach, and taught for 40 years publicly. His work is, the platform sutra in Chinese is called Tan Ching. And it's like the I Ching or the Tao Te Ching, the Tan Ching. The master Hui-neng said, good friends, purify your minds and concentrate on the Dharma of the great perfection of wisdom. The master stopped speaking and quieted his own mind. Then after a good while, he said, good friends, listen quietly. And then he tells the story of his life. What he is doing here is that he is doing what we heard in the Odes of Solomon. He is positioning himself so that you're seeing him by listening to him. He is speaking from such a way that the spaces in between the words, the reality in between the iterative vibrations of things carries something that is secretly there behind all energy frequencies. And that is the interval in between the energy particles, in between the photons, in between the electrons, in between the neutrinos, is nothing, is emptiness. And that if one tunes in just the right way, you can calibrate so that you don't follow the particles, but that you're freed in the spaces. And when you are, the spaces are not distinct, they're a space. They're an infinite openness. And so it's a meditative technique where what he is doing is he is broadcasting Dharma so that you can tune yourself to that, not only in your own special way, but once it is tuned, it is never forgotten again. And this is because of a very peculiar quality. While in the mind, the imagination is a structure, it is able to go into visionary consciousness, and when it does, it gains its dynamic and it becomes a process. It becomes creative imagination. And creative imagination is not a structure, but is a flow. There is a great book on the creative imagination and the Sufism of Ibn Arabi that we use later on in the course. Creative imagination is the process of consciousness in its creativity, and as we'll see starting next week, that's how art gets born. Art emerges from that creative imagination. But in order for that imagination to go from the mind as a form into vision as a process, something that was a process in vision now exchanges with it and goes into the mind, and that's called remembering. Consciousness indelibly is a remembering, but when imagination goes out of the structure of the mind into the flow of vision, into that process, remembering as a process goes into the mind, becomes a structure called the memory. So that now the mind has been given a gift from consciousness, the gift of being able to remember, but to remember as a structure that is there not only with the ideas, but is there especially with the images as well. And so one of the peculiarities is that one acquires an almost unlimited memory. And one of the greatest examples of an unlimited memory in human history, after the Buddha died, he was 80 years old. They call it the Mahaparinirvana. There's a sutra named that. 500 monks got together and decided that they would like to have the words of the sermons of the Buddha recalled to them. And so they brought the Buddha's cousin named Ananda forth. And Ananda, from memory, recited about 17,000 sutras. 34 of them very large, and they're called the Digha Nikaya. Nikayas are like the collections, and the Digha Nikaya are 34 sermons by the Buddha that are very long, sometimes 30 pages, something. Then there were 151 middle-length sutras. They were collected into what's called the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length sayings. And then there were 3 collections of the shorter ones, all arranged because it's a mnemonic according to size. There are so many lines in this group, there are so many lines in this group, and so Ananda, a single person, remembered every sermon of his cousin and recited them. And this is the canon of classical Buddhism. What the Mahayana was was a reading in between the lines. These were the words that the Buddha spoke in formed particles, in words, in sentences, and sutras. But those words have spaces in between them. Those sutras have spaces in between them. Those letters have spaces in between them. And the Mahayana Prajnaparamita Sutras are what one would hear further in the resonances of the spaces, in between the lines, in between the words, in between the various sermons. So what one is hearing is the context of the universal wisdom behind the specific words of the historical Buddha. So one gets here a sense that this is called high dharma. That one learns not just what someone is telling you, or what you understand that they're telling you, or what you understand that many people telling many things that you can put it together in such a way, but that you have a spiritual capacity to go in behind and in between each and every one and all of the letters, words, sentences, ideas, images, and emerge into the openness of the context of everything. And when one does, that person is then said to both be gone and yet there. The word for there in Sanskrit is tathata. The word for someone who is gone in Sanskrit is gata. There is a tathata gata, and that was the name that the Buddha gave himself. He is a tathata gata. He's one whose thusness is gone, yet it's not gone into nothing. Where is it gone? It's gone into empty, infinite presence. So that whenever you're able to be there in that way, he's there in that way. But not there in any kind of a there-ness, but universal. Even more than universal, cosmic. In the Prajnaparamita Sutra, we are told the Buddha is having a dialogue. They're just like dialogues like in the Hermetic dialogues, or the Platonic dialogues, or the dialogues that Mary Magdalene and Thomas and Matthew and Philip have with each other. All of these conversations together, these dialogues together, like the Gelugpas debating together, all of these forms are the way in which the spiritual drama unfolds if you're able to share presence in that openness. And when you do, the Chinese Taoist is saying for it, it's like two birds that fly together. Only instead of hunting for food together, they're enjoying the freedom of the flight together. And so two of the most famous Zen masters right after Hui-neng are a mad poet named Han Shan and his buddy. And the two of them are always laughing. And what they're laughing at, classically in the Zen koan, is they're laughing because one of them stopped sweeping with a broom and pointed to the full moon. And the fact is that the finger pointing at the full moon is obviously that kind of identification limitation, where the finger pointing at the moon was only visible because of the ambience of the moonlight, not because of the moon. And that in that moonlight, the entire night was illuminated out into the universe. And so it was funny to these two Zen masters that they would still be doing things like little boys pointing at something, and yet they were both madly wild, genius, savvy enough to know the context universally. When this quality of wisdom made its way in the early Tang dynasty after Hui-neng. The emperor who founded the Tang dynasty, Tang Taizong, was so taken by the fact that secretly in this were what he called elements of the illustrious religion. And the elements of the illustrious religion is a kind of a Jewish Christianity mixed with early and later Mani, Zoroastrian Manichaeanism. And this quality in Central Asia and Tang times came into the capital city of Chang'an in such a powerful way that it was considered the most esoteric religion on the planet, the illustrious religion. And a later descendant of Tang Taizong erected in Chang'an in 781 AD, it's still there, in Xi'an, a large stela, a inscribed thing like the Rosetta Stone, like the Egyptian obelisks, praising the history of esoteric Jewish Christianity that had made an illustrious revelation all the way through Central Asia, and one of its forms was the Mahayana. That the Mahayana is not derived from Hinduism, it's derived from early Jewish Christianity. It has that esoteric quality, so that one of the greatest sages of the 20th century, D.T. Suzuki, at about 95 years old, one of his last books was called Mysticism, Buddhist and Christian. There are books that always emphasize that Jesus must have been in India, but the fact is, it isn't he that went to India, but it's the spirit of that early quality through Thomas and later on Bartholomew and Mary Magdalene. Buddhism and Christendom, or Jesus the Essene, Arthur Lilly, and he has a number of books, The Influence of Buddhism on Primitive Christianity, India in Primitive Christianity, and many of his books go into all of the iconography that one finds in these last 2,000 years in India, and you see again and again the same kinds of themes that you will find in the early Hellenistic Jewish Christianity. What is mysterious is that the center of that civilization was in what is today the Gobi Desert. And so most of the monuments, most of the cities were desiccated by the Gobi Desert climate. And it wasn't until the exploration of a group of Chinese and Japanese and Europeans in the 20th century that many of these details were found and brought out again. I'll bring next week a photograph of one of the things found in the middle of a cemetery in the middle of what was the city of Luan in the Gobi Desert. It is a bodhisattva that has a St. Andrew's cross in his aura, because it's the St. Andrew's cross that is not only there in the early, it's not about crucifixion, it's about the four quarters balanced together. And the Chinese character for that is the character for 10, a line and then a cross line, so that the perfect 10 in China is the image of the St. Andrew's cross, and there is a great esoteric understanding of it. One last thing, I know our time is almost up. One of the proofs of the power of Christianity in Confucian Taoist China is that in the 19th century, there was a movement called the Taiping Rebellion, where some Protestant Christian tracts that were like street hawking of the lowest common denominator of religious pamphleteering were seen as high wisdom revelations in China, and hundreds of billions of people were swept up in that because it was there almost from the beginning. Next week, Georgia O'Keeffe and Max Ernst.